How's it going, everybody? Today we're going to look at Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, look at the top 10 cards for Pioneer, as well as 5 honorable mentions. We're going to look at some archetypes and styles of decks that I think pick up a lot from Neon Dynasty. And we're going to look at a Blue-Black Rose and Ninjas deck list that I've been brewing up. Before we get into that, be sure to check out my Patreon. Links down below to help support out my content, and be sure to check out my new metafy.gg link if you're interested in any one-on-one coaching to help improve your Pioneer skills. The link should be going live this week. Alright, first let's look at our top 10 cards of Pioneer from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, along with 5 honorable mentions. So we're going to start with the honorable mentions, and then we're going to cover the top 10. So we're going to work backwards here. The 5th honorable mention is Reckoner Bankbuster. This is a 2-mana vehicle that enters the battlefield with 3 charge counters on it. The 4/4 with crew 3. You can pay 2 and tap it to remove a charge counter from the Bankbuster. Draw a card, then if there's no charge counters on Reckless Bankbuster, create a treasure token and a 1/1 colorless pilot creature token. With this creature crews vehicles as though its power were 2 greater. The big reason I think this card is going to be good, or at least well positioned, is I think that vehicles is going to be an archetype that spawns from this new set. You already had some powerful vehicles, especially in the 2-drop slot or 3-drop slot with Heart of Kiran and Aether Sphere Harvester. Now you have a lot of these utility vehicles that Bankbuster allows you to draw 3 cards by the time it runs out of charge counters. You get someone that can crew this and any of your other bigger vehicles, and since you can do it at instant speed, you can use this sort of as like a Mind Maze tome to draw some extra cards on end step if you don't have any creature to crew with. I think this card is a great addition to the vehicles deck, and I think due to the ability to draw the extra cards, create a creature that will crew it itself, and being a 4/4 for 2 mana, there is a good chance that decks that are able to crew this reliably might use it outside of the vehicle shell. It's one of the better cards post-Wrath for these types of decks, since like I said, if you don't have a follow-up creature, your vehicle isn't just dead. Next up, let's move to the 4th honorable mention, and that's going to be Mukotai Soulripper. I apologize for any poor pronunciation. That is something I struggle with, but the Soulripper here is a 1 and a black vehicle, 4/3, crew 2, and whenever it attacks, you may sacrifice another artifact or creature. If you do, put a +1/+1 counter on this card, and it gains menace until end of turn. So crew 2 is a really nice spot, especially for a 2-drop. I'm thinking this goes in mono black aggro decks, the black-red blood decks that we've been seeing a lot of right now. One of the big things that this deck would have access to is blood tokens, or creatures that you don't mind sacrificing, things like Stitcher Supplier. Being able to make your creature, your vehicle creature, larger, get it out of range of a lot of the red removal, give it menace to get around blockers, and be able to sandbag it until later in the game when you want to bring back a creature, and then you can crew it to get around any sort of removal. The other thing is that if you have a card like Kroxa, you can crew with the Kroxa sacrifice trigger on the stack, so you're able to still use your mana efficiently and get an attack in. I think this card goes very well in a lot of these lower to the ground black decks. I don't think it quite fits the vampire model, but most of the other aggressive black decks I think would absolutely love to have this card. Next up is Prodigy's Prototype. As you can see, a lot of the honorable mentions are vehicles, mainly because we don't know if vehicles is going to be a deck. I think it will be, but I think that a lot of the cards have the potential to be quite good. Prodigy's Prototype is 1 white-blue for an artifact vehicle 3/4, crew 2. Whenever 1 or more vehicles you control attack, create a 1/1 colorless pilot creature token with this creature crews vehicles as though its power were 2 greater. So Prodigy's Prototype is a 3/4 vehicle with crew 2 that spits out essentially crew 3s, 1/1 pilots that can crew up to 3. So if you are in a vehicle style deck, this not only allows you to start ramping up the crew level you need to be able to run bigger vehicles, but it also is a very solid body creature, hard to attack into on the ground. And because it's 1 or more vehicles you control, not just this, if you have evasive vehicles, you can still flood the board with smaller creatures while leaving a strong creature back to block. Again, if we see these blue-white, Esper, or Jeskai vehicles decks that I think will have a spot in the new Pioneer meta, or at least we'll see some development early on. Next up, we have our first Planeswalker on the list in the 2nd place for the honorable mentions. That's Tezzeret, Betrayer of Flesh. So Tezzeret is 2 blue, Planeswalker Tezzeret, starts at 4 loyalty. The first activated ability of an artifact you activate each turn costs 2 less to activate. So cost reducing effects, always very strong. So Tezzeret's +1, draw 2 cards, then discard 2 cards unless you discard an artifact. Basically a mini Thirst for Knowledge. This kind of looting is very powerful. If you're flooded on lands in the mid to late game, you can start filtering really aggressively. And if you're playing an artifact style deck with vehicles or just generally powering out artifacts, you're able to discard them nicely. This has the additional advantage of being able to discard cards that may have graveyard synergies. Again, especially in a blue deck, there's plenty of cards that might interact well with the graveyard. -2, target artifact becomes an artifact creature. If it isn't a vehicle, it has base power toughness 4/4. So the key to note here is that it is not until end of turn. This is just turning your artifacts into 4/4s. Darksteel Citadels are indestructible 4/4s. Your excess artifacts laying around are just 4/4s. Vehicles just become creatures, however they retain their power and toughness as a vehicle. So if you're able to put a card like Parhelion 2 into play, you can just turn it into a creature forever, which is very nice. Having that Karn, the Great Creator style ability is very nice, except it's not till end of turn, it's permanent. So it goes very well in these sort of artifact decks we're thinking might exist, being able to filter to the vehicles you want, followed by screwing your excess vehicles into 4/4s. And then it has a -6. You get an emblem whenever an artifact you control becomes tapped to draw a card. As you saw, it starts at 4 and then goes to 5 on the first turn you play it, so it can quickly ult. And this reminds me of some of the old Nissas that would come in, plus for 1 or 2 turns, emblem, and then your goal is to have enough cards that for the Nissa, whenever a land enters, you draw a card. Here, you just tap an artifact and you draw a card. So vehicles, any excess artifacts, especially if you have mana producing artifacts like the Celestis, you're able to start generating massive card advantage. I think there is an interesting spot for Tezzeret. We've seen Paradox Engine style decks in Historic using Karn and Mystic Forge. I think Tezzeret might slot into there as an additional 4-drop Planeswalker, and I think there's an interesting place to look for this card in Pioneer. Last up, our final honorable mention is actual Thirst for Knowledge. So this being a reprint in Neon Dynasty is very big. So for those who don't know, Thirst for Knowledge, 2 and a blue instant, draw 3 cards and discard 2 unless you discard an artifact. So in decks like we're talking about, these artifact heavy decks with vehicles, things like in Soul, anything that has a high artifact count, you're able to pay 3 mana at instant speed to draw 3 and discard your worst artifact. We've seen time and time again, Thirst for Knowledge is very powerful, especially if you need to start filtering for your specific cards. I think artifacts are going to see play. Whenever we get pushed artifacts, they suddenly ramp up in pretty much every format. And I think we'll see a resurgence of artifact heavy deck, or at least at the beginning as people tinker around. All right, let's move on to our actual top 10 here. Number 10 is the only card of the Invoke cycle that makes it onto our list here, and that is Invoke Justice. So 1 white, that's 4 white, sorcery. Return target permanent card from your graveyard to the battlefield, then distribute 4 +1/+1 counters among any number of creatures and or vehicles target player controls. So this is a 5 mana reanimate spell that can bring back planeswalkers, artifacts, any permanent. So if you're able to use cards like Thirst for Knowledge, Tezzeret, to dump high-costing cards into your graveyard, this allows you to not only bring them back, but beef them up, or use it as a finisher to be able to bring back a extra haste creature or just any creature and get 4 +1/+1 counters. We've seen historically how good a card like Verdurous Gearhulk is. So if you're bringing back anything greater than a 4/4 Trampler, this card is ostensibly a more mana-intensive Verdurous Gearhulk. In decks like Mono White Legends, which sees Fringe play already, I think this kind of card could be very strong. Buying back a Yorion or other large enter the battlefield abilities will be huge with this card, especially if you're able to fuel your graveyard at all, or you play against decks that can interact favorably with your board. But I think that the mana gating with the 4 color pips is definitely going to restrict how much this sees play, but I think the power level is definitely there for this to make waves. Moving on to number 9 on our list, we're going to look at Secluded Courtyard. So Secluded Courtyard is a land, and as it enters the battlefield, you choose a creature type. You can tap it to add a colorless mana, or generic mana, or you can tap it to add 1 mana of any color, spend this mana only to cast a creature spell of the chosen type, or activate an ability of a creature card of the chosen type. So we've had Unclaimed Territory. This is just better Unclaimed Territory. It's the exact same card with the exception that you can also activate abilities. So decks that wanted Unclaimed Territory, mana intensive tribal decks, things like humans in Modern, can now be translated more efficiently into Pioneer. I think this card will see a lot of waves and open up the possibility of a lot of decks we didn't know just needed a little bit better mana to be able to see play. And I think things like humans, elves, spirits, dinosaurs, any of these decks could greatly improve by improving their mana. Maybe spirits is a little bit tougher because you're already in a place where your mana is pretty good, and the mono white or mono blue version wants snowlands. But I think a lot of tribal decks will use Secluded Courtyard to great effect. Number 8, we're going to look at Mech, another uncommon land from Neon Genesis. In this case, you can tap to add a generic mana. You can tap to add 1 mana of any color, spend this mana only to cast a pilot or vehicle spell. Like we were talking about, these vehicle decks seem like they're picking up a lot of tools. This allows you to, between Spire of Industry, Mech Hanger, and Mana Confluence, now you can have access to a lot of different lands that can be 5-color lands for vehicles or other artifacts. So you're able to start really diving into potentially being a 5-color vehicles deck, especially if you can use Pilot as one of your land types for Secluded Courtyard. Things like Dapala, all of those cards from Kaladesh use Pilot. The other major thing about this, and the reason a lot of people are really hyped about Mech Hanger, is that for 3 in a tap, you can make target vehicle an artifact creature until end of turn. Means you don't have to crew it. Good post Wrath. You can do it on offense or defense. And you can use it to crew things like Parhelion 2 without actually having to commit creatures to your deck. So it's a nice little way to cheat out crew activations. Especially things like Sky Sovereign that have higher cost crews against removal decks. You can just leverage this to turn on your vehicles without having to commit more to the board. I think Mech Hanger has a long future ahead of it as long as any amount of vehicles see play, and I think they will. Next up, number 7, we have Nashi Moon Sage's Scion. So this card is our first mythic on here in the actual top 10 list. It costs 1 black. It's a legendary creature, Rat Ninja. It's a 3/2 with ninjutsu, 3 and a black. So you can pay 4 to return an unblocked attacker you control to your hand and put this card into the battlefield from your hand, specifically tapped and attacking. So when Nashi deals combat damage to a player, exile the top card of each player's library. Until the end of turn, you may play one of those cards. If you cast a spell this way, pay life equal to its mana value rather than paying its mana cost. What Nashi does when it hits is you look at the top card you exile the top card of each player's library. You can play one of those cards, so you can use lands. If you do, it's free. So lands are free to hit off Nashi, or you can cast a spell from either player's top of the library that was exiled, and you don't have to pay its mana cost. So if you get an attack in and ninjutsu in Nashi, you likely are close to tapped out, but then you still get a free spell. So the benefit of this is if you're playing in a deck that has some high cost spells, you might have to pay a little higher life. But if you're just playing a value-oriented deck that wants to sneak through some damage, sneak through some value with ninjutsu, like the blue-black ninjas or rogues deck, there's a good chance that you'll hit a lower cost creature and just get in a free spell. And the power of free spells and snowballing is incredible, especially in a format like Pioneer, where if you're able to get an advantage, you can often ride that to victory by itself. Next up, another card that I think may exist in these Rogues and Ninjas decks, might not. It really just comes down to how powerful the other ninjutsu creatures are. That is Satoru Umezawa. Costs 1 blue-black, legendary creature human ninja. Whenever you activate a ninjutsu ability, look at the top 3 cards of your library, put 1 of them into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. This ability triggers only once each turn, so if you have multiple ninjutsu creatures, you only get 1 look at the top 3. You don't have to take a ninja. There's no restrictions on what you can take. So activating a ninjutsu ability just lets you look at the top 3 and draw 1. And then each creature card in your hand has a ability of ninjutsu, 2 blue-black, and Satoru is a 2/4. So the benefit of this card is that your large creatures that aren't normally ninjutsu'd, or perhaps cost more to ninjutsu, now cost 2 blue-black. And every time you use the ninjutsu ability, you get to draw a card the best card of your top 3. I think this card has a interesting position in that it does sort of mean you want to be playing non-ninjutsu creatures to get the best out of the second ability, but you want some number of creatures where you can ninjutsu in to get the first ability, or you want to make sure that you have creatures worth flashing in. Obviously, the second ability makes it easier to use the first ability. People speculated originally when it got printed that you'd put in things like Ulamog or Emrakul or things like that, but I think in reality, Satoru to me is a value engine. I don't know how good of an engine it is, but I think if it's good, it will be very good. So I think it's worth testing out in some slots if you can. I think the secondary ability allowing you to push in higher cost creatures is nice, but in reality, if Satoru is good, it's going to be because the first ability just lets you repeatedly get card advantage, especially if you already are playing evasive creatures like in Rogues. The biggest knock against Umezawa is that he costs 3 mana, and I think the Ninjas deck will not be a Lurrus deck. The Rogues deck was definitely a Lurrus deck, and I don't think that Satoru is good enough to push out Lurrus in that style of deck. Next up, we move into our top 5. Number 5 is going to be Greasefang Okiba Boss. This is a 4/3 legendary rat pilot for 1 white-black. At the beginning of combat on your turn, return target vehicle card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains haste. Return it to its owner's hand at the beginning of your end step. The first thing that everyone jumped to is Parhelion 2. It's been mentioned a lot, but it got a lot of tools this set. You look at something like Parhelion 2, and you can just crew it with Greasefang. So you pitch it probably to something like Thirst for Knowledge, and then you play your 3-drop, which then lets you put Parhelion into play, crew it, and you're attacking for 13. And then you pick up Parhelion, which isn't great, but again, if you have ways to discard it reliably, it then just gets brought back again. Greasefang is going to be one of those cards that if your opponent taps out and you're able to play it, usually you're going to get a large advantage. Being able to play something like the Soulripper, the Bankbuster, the Prototype, any of these cards or any vehicle, Heart of Kirin, etc., and then instantly crew it with Greasefang, buy it back if it was removed earlier. I think this card is going to be a big reason to be Esper if you're going to be 3 colors in vehicles, and I think that if there are good vehicles to be played, then Greasefang is a good option to pull you away from just being blue-white. Next up, we have the second blue planeswalker, and that is Kaito Shizuki. Kaito is 1 blue-black for a legendary planeswalker, starts at 3 loyalty. At the beginning of your end step, if Kaito entered the battlefield this turn, he phases out. So that's huge in that if you play Kaito and then you use an ability, Kaito phases out, so it's impossible for your opponent to attack it. A lot of planeswalkers protect themselves. Literally, they create a creature, they remove a creature. This is a good example where you're going to get 2 activations out of Kaito unless when it phases back in, your opponent has a burn spell, or at the end step, they can use a burn spell. But most games, this is a guarantee of 2 activations, which I think is a big reason this card is so good. So what are those activations? Well, +1, draw a card, then discard a card unless you attacked this turn. So it's a blue-black planeswalker, but it incentivizes attacking. So that should already tell you we're looking at rogues, we're looking at ninjas. -2, create a 1/1 blue ninja creature token with this creature can't be blocked. Well, there's our payoff right there. You play Kaito, you make a 1/1 unblockable, you untap the second turn, attack with your 1/1. It either deals damage or you ninjutsu in something bigger. You get the ninjutsu ability, and then you +1 and draw a card. Don't have to discard because you attacked this turn, and you are off to the races. This card fuels itself, helps you dig in deeper. It incentivizes your opponents to attack it, which then leaves you easier opportunity to get in creatures for ninjutsu. It just does everything this deck wants, and if Rogues or Ninjas becomes a strong deck, it is going to use Kaito. I think it is a very powerful card. So let's say you've been plussing for a while. It also has a -7. You get an emblem with whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, search your library for a blue or black creature card, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. Like most emblems, it's going to be backbreaking. If you get to the point where you have drawn 4 extra cards, even if you had to discard and just loot, every time a creature you control deals combat damage, you just get the best creature from your deck that's blue or black. Should be a hard position to lose from. I think Kaito is the best planeswalker in the set. I think the Wanderer is good, but just missed being at the very bottom of the honorable mentions, and I think Tamiyo is not quite to the power level of Pioneer. So I think Kaito 3-mana planeswalkers have a history of being very strong, and I don't think this will be any exception. Next up, I'm cheating a little bit. We're going to look at all 5 of the cycle lands. So the reason is I don't think all of them justify a spot, but I think all of them will see play to some degree. So we're going to go in the order reverse like we've been doing that I have them. So in 5th for the cycle lands is Takanuma, the Abandoned Mine. Legendary land, taps for black, enters untapped. That's going to be true of all of these lands. They're going to be legendary, they're going to enter untapped, and they're going to tap for the color that associate them with, and they are all legendary. So this taps for black. The channel ability, 3 and a black, you can discard it to mill 3 cards and then return a creature or planeswalker from the graveyard to your hand, and this ability costs 1 less to activate for each legendary creature you control. I think this is a fine land. Buying back creatures or planeswalkers, being able to hit planeswalkers is, I think, what makes this a good enough card to see play. Being able to use this to buy back a Sorin out of vampires will get you somewhere, things like that. I think that of the effects, it's definitely the weakest, but it's one of those things that it will help your deck just to have access to at least one. Next up, we have Otawara. Next up, we have Otawara, Soaring City. This is the blue channel land. So for 3 and a blue, discard the Soaring City. Return target artifact, creature, enchantment, or planeswalker to its owner's hand, and this ability costs 1 less to activate for each legendary creature you control. That second tagline will be on all of these as well. So the reason this card I think is worth running, especially in decks like Phoenix, decks like Blue-White Control, basically any blue land or blue strategy, is that you're able to, especially for a deck like Lotus Field or Jeskai Ascendancy, is you can bounce hateful enchantments like Deafening Silence. You can bounce Grafdigger's Cage. I think this land will be a nuisance to decks trying to stop combo decks. I also think being able to bounce a creature or planeswalker and like Narset will be huge. I think this card will see a lot of play out of the combo decks, but only a little bit of play outside of that. Similarly, we have Sokenzen. So we have Sokenzen, Crucible of Defiance, the red channel land. For 3 and a red, you can discard the Crucible of Defiance. Create 2 1/1 colorless spirit creature tokens. They gain haste until end of turn. This ability costs 1 less to activate for each legendary creature you control. So I think the blue land will be more high impact, but I think this land immediately slots in as a 4 of in the Indomitable Creativity decks or the Transmogrify decks. You're able to just play this on end step. Even if you have Fire's Invention out, you can still do this on end step since it's an activated ability, not casting a spell. Enters untapped, taps for red. It does everything you want. Being able to end step, use this through Fires, and then play Creativity or Transmogrify is huge. I think this card will see play anywhere that those effects are played. And I think that even just being able to make 2 1/1s to attack down a Narset is something that a deck like Phoenix might be interested in. Second of the cycle lands, the cycle of channel lands is Iganjo, Seat of the Empire. This is the white channel land. So for 2 and a white, you can discard Iganjo, Seat of the Empire. It deals 4 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. That's a really nice effect for any mid-range or controlling white deck, being able to kill a creature, most creatures in Pioneer, for 2 to 3 mana from one of your lands that can enter untapped, and all your excess copies are just removal spells. I think this card is very, very powerful, especially for control decks, and I think that this is a card that will very quickly make it difficult for players to interact favorably against control decks holding up all of their mana. Obviously, because it only counts legendary creatures, not legendary planeswalkers, it's going to cost the full retail out of blue-white, but I think the fact that it is a land you can just sort of have as a free extra spell slot in your deck will mean it'll see quite a bit of play. Finally, we have Boseiju, Who Endures, the green channel land. For 1 and green, discard it. Destroy target artifact or enchantment or non-basic land an opponent controls. That player may search their library for a land card with a basic land type, which does include triomes, put it onto the battlefield, and then shuffle. So why would this be higher than the blue one? Instead of just bouncing it, it permanently answers your problematic permanents, your Rest in Pieces, your Damping Spheres, your Grafdigger's Cages, everything like that. For combo decks, I think being able to bounce it versus destroy it is same idea, because you're comboing off the turn you bounce it, or you're bouncing it in end step. Boseiju also can hit Thespian Stage, which I think is quite reasonable. It can also hit any of the creature lands from the Forgotten Realms, which I think is, again, quite pertinent. And I think that Boseiju will see a ton of play outside of Pioneer, and perhaps this is being generous to the fact that it will probably see more play in other formats, but I think it's tough to rate Boseiju lower. Even if in Pioneer it might not be as powerful as it is in other formats, it will certainly see play, along with I think most of the land cycle. Number 2 on our list, the penultimate selection, we have Lion Sash. This is a 1 and a white artifact creature equipment cat. You can pay white to exile a card from a graveyard. If it was a permanent, put a +1/+1 on Lion Sash. That includes lands. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each +1/+1 counter on Lion Sash. And then you can reconfigure for 2, which means you can attach it to target creature you control or unattach it from a creature. Reconfigure only as a sorcery, and while attached, this isn't a creature. You get a white Scavenging Ooze. That's a 1/1 for 2 mana. That uses white instead of green to exile, but it doesn't have to be a creature. Any permanent will give it +1/+1 counters. And then when you pay 2 to reconfigure, you can stick it on a creature like a normal equipment. That creature gets buffed. It's protected, so you can just keep growing it, and you can just keep moving it around at will. I think this card is very good. I think it will help mitigate some of the graveyard shenanigans out of decks like Phoenix, and I think it will be a great clock for a lot of decks to have, especially as a sideboard option against decks that want to utilize the graveyard. We've already mentioned a card like Greasefang using the graveyard. I think this card is a must play in Pioneer, especially for white decks. Finally, another white card is our number 1 on the list, and that is Light-paws, Emperor's Voice. I've been very excited about this card since I saw it. It is 1 and a white for a legendary creature, Fox Advisor. It's a 2/2. Whenever an aura enters the battlefield under your control, if you cast it, you may search your library for an aura card with mana value less than or equal to the aura that aura with a different name than each aura you control. Put that card on the battlefield attached to Light-paws, Emperor's Voice, then shuffle. When you look at white-blue auras, or currently it'd be white-black, but I think white-blue is a good place to look. You have cards like SRAM that already give you an engine when you cast your spells. You have protection with things like Alseid and the Sacrifice Dog. Sorry, I don't remember your name. He's a good boy. You have all these effects that can help you protect a big creature. Light-paws means that if you have a different creature and you play out an aura, you get to search out an aura of equal or lesser value and then put it on Light-paws. So you're instantly building 2 threats. Something that these white-blue decks struggled with was having multiple threats at the same time. So you're building multiple threats. You're a Lurrus deck, so you're able to rebuy Light-paws later if it ends up being killed. And then you get to do something interesting. You're able to play a lot of one-ofs, things like Grifspoon, the cartouches, the 2 mana +2/+2 and flying enchantment. You get to play Curious Obsession. You get to play Staggering Insight. You get to play all of these auras that have unique effects, because any aura you cast can now search out these other auras. And of course, you still want to make sure you have your 4 ofs of things like Ethereal Armor, all the glitters, but for every Ethereal Armor, you get another enchantment. So Ethereal Armor instantly is better. All the glitters can fetch an Ethereal Armor, and instantly your power has skyrocketed. All of these cards work in harmony with each other, and I think blue-white auras is a great place to look. You get things like Stubborn Denial. You get a lot of good hate cards that are already enchantments, things like Deafening Silence. You get a lot of good artifact hate and things like Rest in Peace. I think you're just well positioned to attack the format, and I think that Light-paws will allow you to end the game quickly enough by creating such aggressive threats and being able to pick out really good niche effects that otherwise you would just be hoping to draw. Now you can guarantee them. So for me, Light-paws, Emperor's Voice is the number 1 card for Pioneer from Neon Dynasty. We're just gonna quickly recap 5 of the archetypes or styles of decks that I think picked up a lot from Neon Dynasty. That's going to be vehicles. I think probably Esper or blue-white. Rogues and ninjas, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Blue-white auras. Like I said, I think Light-paws makes a huge difference in both the way that deck is built and how strong it's going to be. Tezzeret artifacts, which I think is going to potentially look like a Paradox engine deck, or just leverage the fact that you have a lot of good artifacts, including vehicles, and Tezzeret is a good engine. And then I think you're going to see a increase in tribal decks, whether it's humans, elves, etc., through having a little bit better mana and being able to just facilitate colors the same way that modern humans did. You're missing something like an Ancient Ziggurat, but otherwise I think your mana gets a lot better than it was. Let's take a quick look at a blue-black rogues and ninjas deck. It's going to come up on the screen here. Walk you through it. This is a list that I was tinkering with. Let's start with 4 Kaito Shizuki. Once again, I think this card is excellent and will help enable these kind of decks much better than you would expect. The fact that it protects itself is huge. Next up, Merfolk Windrobber, a staple of the rogue decks. Then we have 2 Nashi, Moon Sage's Scion. Like I said, ninjutsu cards go way up when your deck is already very evasive. Plus, this gets you a free card from one of both decks. Or sorry, it gets you a free card, one from each deck to look at. You can play lands off it if you need to hit your land drops. And otherwise, you're just able to pretty reliably attack the opponent through evasive creatures, so you should be constantly drawing extra cards. Next up, we have 4 Silver Fur Master. This is the Ninja Lord, as well as... So this is the Ninja Lord that gives other ninjas and rogues +1/+1, so it helps all of your creatures, which is huge. It has ninjutsu itself, so it can activate your ninjutsu abilities, and it makes your ninjutsu abilities cost 1 less to activate. Again, look at something like Nashi. If you got it for 2 in a black instead of 3 in a black, I think it is a absolute beating of a card. Next up, we have Soaring Thought Thief. Again, classic staple of these rogue decks. Alongside Thieves Guild Enforcer, great early drops. Thieves Guild Enforcer is very hard to block because you don't want to trade with a Death Touch creature. And again, these creatures that can lock down the ground allow you to have invasive threats and then ninjutsu buy it back, and then you get another instance of the mill trigger. Next up, you have Zansereth the Trickster. Very powerful card. Doesn't technically have ninjutsu. It sort of has the templating of ninjutsu, but especially with deck that's using Thieves Guild Enforcer and Soaring Thought Thief, being able to steal cards from the opponent's graveyard is a very powerful effect. Next up, we have 2 Brazen Borrowers. Again, very powerful card, pretty huge across all formats, just allows you to deal with any problematic creatures. And again, a 3/1 evasive creature that you will ninjutsu and now you have 2 spells is very impressive. Being able to bounce your opponent's best permanent, attack them for 3, get a better effect on damage, and then you have another petty theft ready. Very, very hard for opponents to get out of that. Next up, we have Moon Circuit Hacker. This is a 1 blue enchantment creature human ninja, ninjutsu of just blue. The 2/1 that whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you can draw a card. If you do, discard a card unless it entered the battlefield this turn. So if you ninjutsu this card, you just get to draw a card, which again, given the pervasiveness of our unblockable and evasive creatures, this just means that you're able to draw a free card a lot of the turns, which is always powerful. And if it is past that first turn, you can trade off a lot of aggressive creatures, or if it gets in for another point, you can ninjutsu it back to your hand if you want to get another shot at drawing a card for free, or you just get to loot and find your best cards. 4 Drown in the Lock as pieces of interaction against your opponent's hand. Again, these have been powerful in all rogue decks in the past. Or Fatal Push, being able to interact with your opponent. Easy side outs against decks that don't have creatures, but in the creature matchups, again, killing creature, easy to push through a creature for free, and then ninjutsu. And 1 Cling to Dust just to deal with graveyard threats, recursion, and keep cards like Phoenix in check. Land base isn't anything too wild. We have 1 Agadeem's Awakening, 4 Shipwreck Marsh, 1 of each basic, 2 Hive of the Eye Tyrants, 1 Hall of Storm Giants, all pretty common staples. 2 Zagreum Triomes to be able to cycle, as well as get both colors of mana on turn 1 if you don't have a 1-drop. 4 Pathway, 4 Water Graves, and then 1 of the blue and black channel lands. Being able to pick up some of your bigger creatures from the graveyard is very powerful, as well as being able to bounce any permanents that are getting in your way. And again, you have a couple of legendary cards, not many, but even if you're able to bounce something for 3 mana, a lot of times it will ensure that your creature gets in for ninjutsu. So I think it's important to have at least access to 1 of those. Sideboard, you have a lot of staples, your Thoughtseizes, your Goblinks, your Disputes, your Aether Gust, another Cling to Dust, your Damping Spheres, and then 1 Zareth San in matchups where your opponent is going to be playing some big stuff. So if you can steal it, there's a good chance the game just ends. I think it's pretty straightforward. Obviously, it's not super tuned. It's just a rough draft. But I think decks like this are going to have a lot of ground to work with. And I'm very excited to see where Pioneer trends with the advent of Kamigawa. Thanks, everybody, for watching this video. I appreciate you taking the time to go over the top 10 cards in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. And with that, be sure to check out the links down below for my Patreon, which really helps me out, lets me continue to make this content as often as I do. Check out my Twitch stream, all my links down the Linktree link down below. And be sure to check out my new Metafy page, where I'll be doing one-on-one coaching to help out with Pioneer. Be sure to leave a comment letting me know what your top 10 cards from Kamigawa are, as well as what decks you're tinkering with.